Hello, everybody. My name is Alexander Loki, and we're here to discuss the importance of vocabulary in secondary language acquisition and its influence on the developmental stages of proficiency. So let's get started. The researcher Keith Fultz once said, "While without grammar, very little can be conveyed, without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed." It's a pretty astute observation, I'd say. I'd have to agree with that. And here's what I wrote. When compared to grammar in SLA, especially in college courses, many researchers and instructors give vocabulary much less emphasis in the classroom and in curriculum development. This could be due to practicality restraints like time or money or books. It's really hard to find books with just vocabulary, trends in secondary language theory, and just anything that could impede the importance of vocabulary. So here's one of my questions. How can we tie together learning and acquisition with vocabulary as a means to enhance proficiency in the other domains of secondary language acquisition, like reading and writing and speaking and listening? And what stages are these strategies useful? We all know that Krashen says that that we do learn separately between acquisition and learning, and my theory is we can bring them both together through vocabulary. So let's continue. Why is this relevant to the field of secondary language acquisition? Well, here's my theory. Vocabulary encourages language acquisition in the earlier stages, especially when it's scaffolded. It catalyzes language skills in the intermediate stages of development. This can be just through comprehension or a variety of other strategies. And it also galvanizes proficiency at the advanced stages of secondary language acquisition. And you can find that when you get into focusing on maybe college level language that is germane or esoteric to the material that's being taught, the content. So let's keep continuing. Why is it important for me? All right, I teach at Towson University. I never know if I'm going to teach beginning, intermediate, or advanced until a week or two before the semester starts. So I have to be pretty malleable and flexible with my teaching ability and understanding and planning. So I do think that there are stages that you can incorporate an emphasis of vocabulary with. At the beginning stages, scaffolding with key vocabulary and basic vocabulary really helps form a stronger foundation of concept and meaning behind what students are going to work with. And the intermediate stages, like language transfer and even comprehensible input, which you can find in beginning and advanced stages, this is when you are putting together methods for increasing the intermediate stages of secondary language acquisition. And the advanced stages, you just need to practice vocabulary based on career goals or just the content of the college course. So if I have STEM students, the advanced stages of secondary language acquisition will be STEM heavily influenced vocabulary. So let's move on to Krashen, who has three theories: the input hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, and the effective filter hypothesis. But let's begin with the input hypothesis. Krashen states that we do need a comprehensible input that's just a bit outside of our capacity in order to actually learn and acquire. An observation that came from Yang and Wang from 2013 are these four observations that allude to Krashen. Learners cannot find the proper word during communication. They cannot express their feelings with the proper words. They cannot put the words that they've learned into practice, which is very common. And they can't identify the words when they're listening to others talk. And if you know Krashen, he's all about listening as comprehensible input and reading as comprehensible input. So vocabulary is a major part of listening and reading. But this is not where it ends. The effective filter talks about three solid things: emotion, motivation, and personality. How does that tie into vocabulary? Well, if you're an effective teacher, you will cater to these three emotions. So let's keep going. And the monitor hypothesis. This is also very important as a teacher when you're planning and executing, and as a student when you're learning. Do you have enough time with the material? Are you focusing on the form or whether or not it's correct? And is it viable to the rules? Now, there are rules with vocabulary, even though a lot of people think that it's mostly with with grammar. And that's not always the case, because there are collocations with vocabulary. There's concept, as Terence Odlin would say from 2005. There's meaning, as he would also say. These rules apply to context and situation, which we will get to in another research. So let's begin with the first research. Here we have something with Yu Wang and Zhen Yang. They implemented Krashen's three theories: the input hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, and the effective filter hypothesis, and applied it to oral college English classes in China with Mandarin-speaking students. And I will explain this a little further. But what they really do is I'll just explain it. All right, here's where the study begins. It took place in China with college-level students. They've been learning English for 6 to 7 years, and they all have a similar proficiency with English. There are 30 of them. They speak Mandarin, and the target language is oral English. Now, Krashen would not have a good time hearing that we're applying his input theories to oral English, because he believes mostly in listening and in reading. Well, this is where the research gets interesting. Yang and Wang split these 30 students into two groups. And they broke them into groups of 15. One group is invariable. They are constant, and what they receive will not change. But the subject group of 15 are broken into 3 other groups. Each group is given 6 essays monthly, and one group, or the subject group, all 3 of those little groups get essays with highlighted key vocabulary words, and then the other group doesn't get anything. And after a month of reading, the students are evaluated orally. But they start with the pretext. Actually, that should say 30 students, but this is quoted from Yang and Wang. All 30 students are given the same topic about economy, and each of them is required to give an oral presentation within 5 minutes, one by one, of their speeches that are recorded on MP3 files. This is where the teacher comes in, as does the monitor hypothesis. The teacher gives a grade between pronunciation and intonation, grammar, vocabulary, fluency, personality, and any other things that may stick out for the teacher. And the monitor hypothesis is incorporated here because the students can speak freely without any anxiety, and they have enough time to actually get out what they need to say. And the teacher writes down their pre-test skills, and then they continue. When the experimental process begins, the students are provided the essays, as I had already said, and then they're evaluated. They speak for 5 more minutes at the end of their essays. Now the subject group with the 3 groups, they each have 3 different groups of key vocabulary that are highlighted, while the invariable group has nothing highlighted. The input hypothesis stands out here, which makes a very interesting case for the input hypothesis, because what is being focused on, this could also be the monitor hypothesis, in the vocabulary storage phase of the reading. The highlighted vocabulary will point out information that students need to focus on. If it's not highlighted, a student can browse right over it, and that could hurt their language acquisition and learning. So the third step is after a month, the students are evaluated and tracked for their oral production of the essays. They commence the evaluation under the same requirements and procedures as the pretest, but this time the teacher has a different guide for the vocabulary. How do they produce orally? Here's an example of the subject groups with the vocabulary that subject group 1, subject group 2, and subject group 3 would work with. I'll give you a second to look at that. So, they repeat the process each month. Each month, all 30 students will continue to produce orally their comprehension and understanding of the essay material. And the affective filter shines in here because students' self-perception and well-being correlate to the level of success in these results. It instructs teachers to pay attention to the students' emotional factors, and this is where this chart comes in. Students can monitor their moods each day. Did they hear any jokes, which is key for language acquisition? Did they learn any new vocabulary, whether they're subjects or not? Do they have any questions and new words that may be involved? So after these 2 semesters of research, the students are tracked, and this is the final result. These are the average errors between the subject group and the invariable or otherwise ordinary group that you can see. Key vocabulary is very important to students. This is the findings of Yang and Wang. Key vocabulary is very important to students in oral English presentation and expression. As long as students pay enough attention to words and phrases related to a topic, they will be more likely to use them in real communication. The learning and teaching of vocabulary with context is an effective way enhancing students' memory of words and phrases. Krashen's theories in the reading do coincide helpfully with the students' oral production. My evaluation is that students need to feel comfortable in their context of learning while also having time and encouragement to master the materials. If they maximize their self-perception, students will increase their motivation and improve the traits of their personality, maybe, and even reduce anxiety. I also think that vocabulary is both learned and acquired best when directly highlighted as a means of learning the material. This is where the monitor hypothesis really comes in. They focus, they notice, all right? Krashen's theories are highly applicable in vocabulary learning and acquisition, and more than ever, English in the working world requires vocabulary. This is necessary for cross-cultural communication, expression, and clarity. And this is relevant to my research question, because vocabulary is essential for finding the right word to the meaning. They need to find the rules. They need to notice these words and learn to apply them in the proper way. When vocabulary is taught with a heavy influence in a reading assignment, it can be tantamount to oral production and output. All right, Krashen doesn't really like output as much as a comprehensible input, but that's not what Yang and Wang are talking about. Krashen would agree that the input aspect is very viable here. Vocabulary does not need to be a primary lesson, this is how I feel, but it is maximized when it is layered into other lessons, especially reading. As Krashen states, learning and acquisition are separate, but vocabulary can bring the two to work in unison when contextualizing vocabulary. Here's the next study. This is from Alice Marie Johnson from 2008. Now, she looked at the effectiveness of contextualization on secondary language acquisition using situational discourse model. And we will get to that. But the key word here is situation. How do these students learn from the situation, and how can they contextualize vocabulary through this situation? And I'm just going to read this really quickly. In traditional classrooms, a second language is taught via thematic word sets, grammatical explanations, and patterns and tactic practice. This study compared a traditional teaching approach to a scaffolded teaching approach consisting of words within a narrative context. Vocabulary learning and sentence generation were measured following each session. Results show that the print was an important support used by participants in the traditional condition. However, across time, vocabulary learning and sentence length increased significantly more in the scaffolded condition. Now, what does this mean? She separated traditional vocabulary teaching to scaffolded, progressive vocabulary teaching. Now, how does she do this? I will explain. But first, let me tell you about the people, the students who are being studied. These are 5th grade students. She put out a flyer, learn free Spanish, and a bunch of parents brought their kids forward. This is in Louisiana. And they're all beginning Spanish learning students, and they all speak American English. And they're all very beginning. So she wanted to measure the effectiveness of vocabulary through the 2 approaches of the semantic discourse model, traditional versus scaffolding. All right. This is all in the contextualized situation of learning vocabulary through a situation. What is contextual? Well, it's when objects have concrete references. Now, where do you think that's going to be? Traditional or scaffolding? All right. Decontextualized experiences can be inferred from the text. Where do you think that's going to be? Scaffolding or traditional? The answer is scaffolding. So the students' objectives here. They needed to learn how to write 3 sentences in Spanish through the 2 models that are alternated between traditional and scaffolded teaching. They're given pictures that follow traditional teaching of vocabulary, and one is very guided. It's very contextual. It gives labels. It gives questions with written out. And the other one is just pictures that require more interaction and feeling with the language itself. But she wanted to get 100 words down, and 50 words are from scaffolding and 50 words are from traditional. So here are some of the exercises that she did for scaffolding. She did close exercises, binary choice, phonemic cue, and expansion. And I already explained that. But here are some of the pictures. This is comprehensible input and the monitor hypothesis. All right, they got enough time to look at these pictures. They have to make inferences. They have to notice. They have to understand what is happening. There's a lot of action and a lot of nouns, lots of nouns and verbs in this picture. Same here. And also here. This is actually the first picture that they start with. A cat is stuck in a tree. Be probably a lot of fun. Now, the traditional strategies are the students interact with these pictures that are labeled, contextualized, if you will, and then probing follows. So the students have this choral repetition all together with the teacher asking questions and verb conjugations, and it's actually very structured and, in fact, effective. So let's look at some of the papers here. Here you can see the labels and the questions at the bottom right here. Here's another page and a third page. Everyone's eating dinner, la cena, la sopa de tomate, etc. All right, well, here are the findings. Students initially performed better with the traditional learning. So a lot of traditionalists would be happy to learn this. But that's not totally true, because over time, the scaffolding approach worked a lot better because these students are using more interaction with the vocabulary terms. They're using inferences, and it's almost decontextualized. They're creating their own meaning from their own situations. And this creates a mental representation for the language. When they are using this language, they're referring to these pictures that are created in their minds. And this is where Goldstein really comes through with his situational model of 2005. So I really think that traditional learning for vocabulary is good, but it only really accesses short-term memory retrieval, not so much in the way that scaffolding does, where these students are learning more for a longer period of time. and it's more challenging in the beginning, but it also keeps it interesting, which goes back to the effective filter hypothesis and the monitor hypothesis. These students aren't going to lose interest as quickly with scaffolding as they do with the traditional approach, and that's exactly what happened. Students got really bored with the traditional approach, and they didn't do well at the end. So I truly think that scaffolding has more merit in the long term. But I also think that this experiment wasn't long enough. Again, it's with volunteers, so I guess for the sake of practicality, you can't really get much more. But in that same realm, this same research could be repeated a lot more and recorded, because I would really like to see how scaffolding with vocabulary could play on a large scale analysis. So I'd also like to read some of the transcripts that were used for the scaffolding process. What did she ask? What were some of these questions, and how were the students responding? All I saw were their test results. So how is this relevant to my research question? Well, vocabulary does not need to be primarily taught, and it can be incorporated over time. Contextualizing vocabulary works incredibly well for both short-term and long-term vocabulary recall, but the situation is what matters. Traditional vocabulary works well with short-term memory, and that's good for the beginning stages. But if we're with beginning learners, then yeah, start with the traditional learning approach, but then incorporate the input hypothesis, incorporate the more challenging and more interesting scaffolding approach to vocabulary. And you can layer that into assignments. You don't have to focus 100% on vocabulary. The third research study that I evaluated was from Faith A. Brown out of Botswana, Africa. Her research was entitled Vocabulary Knowledge and Comprehension in Secondary Language Text Processing. Is it a reciprocal relationship? All right, what does that mean? It means kind of like what Krashen said, that learning and acquisition are separate. But she's saying almost allegorically, or questioning allegorically, the same thing. Is vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension a separate thing, or is it reciprocal? So I'm just going to read her quote of the abstract for the study. A standardized vocabulary level test, comprehension test, and questionnaire were used to investigate how students process their information. This all goes back to Krashen again, because this goes into the background knowledge, their familiarity with English, how they feel about it, and their motivation and where they're going with all of it. They ask these questions before with the vocabulary test, and then they ask questions after a comprehension test. So it really does show the relationship between vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension. So this is in the University of Botswana. There are 50 first-year social science students, and they were randomly sampled. There were 16 men and 14 women. I mean, no, 34 women, but that doesn't really apply to this. They're all college-age students, but they've been working with English for 12 to 13 years. And this is interesting. But in Botswana, Setswana is the majority of the nation's language. So a lot of people speak English, but it's not their primary language. But they do feel comfortable with it. So this is the question she posits. Are vocabulary knowledge and text comprehension mutually interdependent in the reading of expository texts by first-year ESL students? She asks this general question, but she goes further into the topic of vocabulary knowledge through range-scaled frequency words, like high-frequency words, low-frequency words. And she expands how the students can achieve through higher exposure to these frequency words. So how do mid to low frequency words affect comprehension and reading? So she broke the students into groups again. No, she did not break them into groups. She broke the course into two different tests. One's a vocabulary test and the other's the comprehension test. So here's a vocabulary test. They fill out a questionnaire about themselves before they take the test. And then they take the vocabulary test, and we'll see a sample of that. And this test has low to high frequency vocabulary words in total. And it's broken down into 5 parts. And you can see that from words ranging from 2,000 word level to 10,000 word level, how do these students fare with these frequency words? Here is the questionnaire. How many languages do you speak? State your home language. You can see these. These questions really garner the students' experience and understanding of vocabulary. And this is an example of a vocabulary test. They have to find which of these words match with the definition. It's very reliable. It's cut and dry. This is the word. This is the definition. The comprehension test was a little different, but they focused on an essay about globalization. And this had a lot of high frequency words in it. And globalization is a pretty common topic, so it's pretty reliable as well. Then after that, they take a questionnaire on how they actually psychologically processed the text, which is kind of metacognitive. The purpose is to see if background vocabulary can affect comprehension. So this is the questionnaire at the end of the study that shows how the students fared with reading. Do they possess the previous knowledge of the topic? About half said yes, about half said no. Do they possess previous knowledge of the content? Not many people said they understood that. Do they have a clear understanding of the text? Yeah, kind of. And were the clues, contextual clues, would help them? The position of the words help them. They understand the text through new and difficult words. And did the vocabulary knowledge help them understand the text? How would they rate the text? Difficult, average, or simple? Nobody said it was simple. This also creates a little bit of reliability. These were the findings. Students either pretty uniformly scored almost the exact same score with vocabulary and comprehension, but then you can see a few students who just bombed the vocabulary, or no, bombed the comprehension, but still did pretty well with, no, they did well with the vocabulary, but they didn't do very well with comprehension. So the students who scored higher on the vocabulary test, that's to be expected. And I think it's because the test was a little easier. But the most difficult words for the students were superterritoriality, proliferate, encapsulate, manifestations, contours, reversal, and halt. You can see that all these words range from the 2,000 to 10,000 word frequency. But the students also reported that the vocabulary knowledge helped them understand the text, just as understanding the text helped them understand the meaning of the new words. So it can be concluded that both vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension interact during text processing. My evaluation is that this test kind of lacked a cohesive determination between vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension, because I still think that the results were a little volatile. I don't know how you can separate vocabulary from reading comprehension other than just knowing that these students have a high vocabulary, but it doesn't help them with their comprehension in some cases, and it does with others. That to me was a little murky, so I don't know how you can make a clear determination through this process that there's a worthy attempt at seeing a reciprocal relationship between vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension. But the fact that vocabulary knowledge usually did score higher than the comprehension itself shows that isolated, vocabulary is easier to access than comprehension itself. And the fact that these students did say yes to that proves that maybe we still do need vocabulary. Well, we definitely still need vocabulary to better our comprehension. I also think there needs to be way more testing. They only did 2 tests. I don't think, like, there are so many variables that could change any of the scores of the 50 people. But I do feel that vocabulary and comprehension are helpful to each other. But background vocabulary really helps comprehension more than comprehension helps vocabulary, for the most part. Students that said they could understand a vocabulary word from the context of the sentence less than the reinforcement of comprehension through vocabulary. This just means this forced students to use their own strategies to understand comprehension. And to me, it made it seem like vocabulary is kind of separate from comprehension. But that's not what Brown said. Students may have used certain strategies, sometimes subconsciously, to help them understand the text. Instead, the sole reliance of existing vocabulary knowledge. So even if students didn't understand what they were reading, they still use strategies to understand what they were reading outside of vocabulary. It proves that high-frequency words should be taught, though, and they should be exposed to high-frequency words, and even low-frequency words in advanced classes. Teaching skills to comprehend with vocabulary is extremely important for students who are working with comprehensible output. So how do I tie this all together? Krashen's hypothesis are really guidelines to follow in the classroom and when you're planning your lessons or even developing a curriculum, because the key here is you need a relaxed environment with guided vocabulary as a comprehensible input. It doesn't need to be guided as much as it needs to be highlighted, or students need to be challenged to understand vocabulary. But vocabulary should not be ignored. Teachers should encourage their students to grow from the foundation they build with vocabulary. And a real positive way to do that is through scaffolding. And I think you can scaffold a lot in the beginning, middle, and advanced stages of proficiency. And it just leads to better proficiency in reading and oral production. And the situation, going back to the second study, the situation for students with new vocabulary can help students contextualize and learn. So what does this mean for language teaching? I think scaffolding is a key. But traditional vocabulary teaching should not be ignored, especially in the beginning stages of development. I think Krashen's theories hold true, especially with vocabulary. The effective filter hypothesis is important for the emotion and the motivation and the personality of the students, especially in a classroom. The monitor hypothesis, the students need time, exposure with these vocabulary words, and they need to focus on the form and the correctness of these words, and they need to know the rules of these words. And the input hypothesis, obviously, students need to be challenged. But with this challenging, they cannot be misguided. The teachers need to motivate the students. This will make them more open to comprehension and trying to produce. And I just think vocabulary is a great method of teaching when layering it into lessons. It brings together both learning and acquisition because it puts words in grammatical, syntactical, and semantic context. For further research, I think it's okay to incorporate vocabulary lessons into teaching, but I would like to see case studies with vocabulary where students start at beginning levels and move to advanced English or secondary languages. And I'd like to see how vocabulary affects them over that long run. And I'd also like to garner some of their strategies that they use subconsciously. I'd like to understand more of that. I think students should also, we should test more of their motivation and how classrooms can motivate students, especially unmotivated students. I'd like to see how a classroom can be quantified in terms of motivating students. And students, they don't need to spearhead their way through reading comprehension through just one strategy of word attack or context clues. I think that the traditional strategy of learning vocabulary is important, but scaffolding, I'd like to see more inferred scaffolding and the research that could be conducted for that. And these are my sources. Thank you. I guess to tie this all in, what is the integrity of vocabulary in learning acquisition, secondary language acquisition? I think vocabulary, when taught right, using the effective filter, the monitor hypothesis, and the input hypothesis, it can bring these separate ideas of acquisition and learning together. And there are multiple approaches to do this, whether you're highlighting words to make them notice, whether you're scaffolding with inference and exposure, or whether you're engaging the students to access their background vocabulary to comprehend their studies. Thank you.